In today's episode, we'll be sharing some disturbing horror stories. So before we begin, consider giving us a like. It helps a lot. Also, feel free to share your true stories. I might add it to a future video. Who knows? The farm was my sanctuary. Surrounded by dense woodland, it offered a quiet life, far removed from the chaos of towns and cities. Most evenings, after the day's work was done, I'd grab my flashlight and head out for a walk. The woods felt like an extension of my home, their winding paths familiar and comforting. It wasn't unusual for my cat, an adventurous little thing, to trot along beside me, her white fur a faint glow in the dim light. That night was no different, or so I thought. The air was crisp, the kind of autumn chill that bit at your cheeks but felt refreshing after a day indoors. The moon was new, leaving the woods pitch black. My flashlight cut a narrow beam through the darkness, its light bouncing off the gravel road and the occasional glint of an animal's eyes in the underbrush. The stillness was calming, broken only by the crunch of my boots and the soft patter of my cat's paws. I wasn't afraid of the dark, not here, in the place I knew so well. The farm and its surrounding woods had always felt safe, even in the deepest hours of the night. But as I ventured further down the road, something changed. My cat paused, her ears twitching toward the trees, and I stopped too, shining my flashlight into the dense foliage. I saw nothing, heard nothing. The moment passed, and I continued, brushing off the unease as a trick of my imagination. After all, it was just another walk, like so many before. But I had no idea that something was waiting for me further down the path. I was midway through my usual circuit when I heard it. A voice, faint but distinct, cutting through the stillness. Help. The word hung in the air, monotone and unnatural. My feet froze in place, and the flashlight trembled slightly in my hand as I turned toward the sound. It had come from somewhere in the woods, just off the road. Help. The voice called again, the same flat tone, neither frantic nor weak, just wrong. It didn't sound like someone in pain or panic. It was too steady, too deliberate. Yet the word itself, that universal cry for aid, tugged at something instinctual in me. Someone could be hurt, lost, or worse. My first thought was to call out, but the words caught in my throat as a chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. I took a hesitant step toward the trees, shining my flashlight into the underbrush. The beam illuminated twisted branches and the skeletal outlines of saplings, but nothing else. "Hello?" I called softly, the sound of my own voice startling me in the oppressive silence. "Help." The voice repeated, exactly the same as before, no closer, no farther, no louder, no softer. It was as if someone had pressed play on a recording. The realization hit me like ice water. This wasn't normal. My heart thudded in my chest as the pieces clicked together. If someone were truly in trouble, their voice wouldn't sound like this. The tone wouldn't be so mechanical, so emotionless. I stepped back, my hands tightening around the flashlight as I looked down at my cat. She was crouched low, her fur bristling, her wide eyes fixed on the woods. She had sensed it too, whatever it was. Without a second thought, I scooped her up and turned back toward the farm. The voice called out again, "Help!" But I didn't stop. This time I didn't dare look back. Clutching my cat tightly to my chest, I broke into a run. The flashlight beam bounced erratically, its pale glow barely lighting the gravel road ahead. My footsteps echoed in the dark, each one accompanied by the pounding of my heart. The voice called out again, "Help!" its monotone delivery freezing the air around me. I didn't look back. The farm wasn't far, but in that moment, it felt like miles. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me, every rustling leaf a threat. The voice called once more, distant but unwavering. Help. It wasn't following me, not exactly, but it lingered, its presence clinging to me like a cold fog. My instincts screamed at me to keep moving, to get inside, to shut it all out. I ran faster, my breaths shallow and sharp, my legs burning with effort. When I finally reached the farmhouse, I bolted inside, slamming the door behind me and twisting the lock. My cat squirmed in my arms, leaping free the moment I released her. She darted under the couch, her eyes glowing faintly as she peered out at me. I stood there, panting, the flashlight still clutched in my trembling hand. The house was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting just beyond the windows. I turned off the flashlight and pressed myself against the wall, peering out through the curtain. The road and the woods beyond were empty, swallowed by the night, but the voice still echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder of what I'd left behind. Sleep was out of the question. The voice, the monotone call for help, replayed in my head over and over. What if someone really was in trouble? The thought gnawed at me, even as my gut insisted something about the situation was wrong. I couldn't let it go. Finally, I decided to tell my mother. She was skeptical at first, brushing it off as a trick of the wind or an animal mimicking a human sound. But when she saw how shaken I was, she agreed to investigate. We drove out together, her hands steady on the wheel as the car's high beams cut through the darkness. The woods looked different from the safety of the vehicle, less threatening, but no less mysterious. My mother stopped near the spot where I had heard the voice, the engine idling as we rolled down the windows. "Hello," she called out, her voice firm and clear. The sound echoed briefly before fading into silence. I held my breath, straining to hear any response. But the woods were quiet, their oppressive stillness returning as if the voice had never been there. We waited, calling out again, but there was no answer. After several minutes, my mother shook her head. "There's nothing here," she said, her tone calm but edged with impatience. I nodded, though the unease in my chest hadn't lessened. As we turned back toward the farmhouse, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone emerge from the trees. But the road behind us was empty. The next morning, we searched the area on foot. The sunlight should have brought clarity, but it only emphasized how little there was to find. No footprints, no disturbed brush, no signs of anyone in distress. Nothing. Leaving behind only the questions. The long stretch of highway had grown darker with every passing mile. It was late, and the holiday road trip that had started with excitement and laughter now felt more like a test of endurance. The emptiness of the road stretched on endlessly, the faint hum of the tires on asphalt the only sound breaking the silence. When the small, dimly lit gas station appeared in the distance, it felt like a relief, a chance to refuel, stretch our legs, and let our husky Coda do the same. As we pulled in, however, that initial sense of relief quickly faded. The station was old, its fluorescent lights flickering faintly against the surrounding darkness. The only signs of life were a few employees standing outside, their cigarettes glowing faintly in the shadows. They watched us as we parked, their stares lingering a little too long for comfort. "I'll take Coda out for a walk," I said to my boyfriend as we stepped out of the car. He nodded, heading toward the pump to start refueling. I grabbed Coda's leash and began walking toward the edge of the parking lot, hoping to give him a little space to stretch. But as I glanced back, I noticed the employees were still watching us, their conversations falling quiet as I moved farther away. A knot of unease began to form in my stomach. The night air was cold, and the quiet felt oppressive. Coda sniffed around the gravel, his tail wagging, oblivious to the strange tension I was feeling. That's when I saw it, a small dog, emerging from the shadows at the edge of the lot. It was scruffy but not unkempt, wearing a collar that suggested it belonged to someone. It approached cautiously, tail wagging slightly, and I knelt down to get a closer look. "Hey there, buddy," I said softly, extending a hand. The dog hesitated, then inched closer, sniffing my fingers before licking them. It seemed friendly, but something about its presence felt off. I glanced around, expecting to see its owner nearby, but the area was empty except for the employees and my boyfriend at the pump. Coda perked up as the small dog came closer, wagging his tail in curiosity. The little dog darted forward, nudging my leg before turning and trotting toward the back of the gas station. It stopped after a few steps, looking back at me expectantly, as though it wanted me to follow. I stood up, unease prickling at the back of my neck. "Where's your owner?" I muttered, glancing around again. My boyfriend, noticing the interaction, walked over. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low. I gestured to the dog. "It has a collar, but no one's around. It keeps trying to lead me somewhere." Coda barked softly, his attention fixed on the stray. My boyfriend frowned but followed as the dog trotted ahead, heading toward the back of the station. The area was poorly lit, with only the faint glow of a single floodlight casting long shadows across the gravel. As we rounded the corner, I spotted a glass door leading into what looked like a storage area. Behind it stood a large man, his figure barely visible through the smudged glass. The stray barked once and sat at the door, as though waiting for the man to respond. When he noticed us, he opened the door slightly, peering out with an expression that immediately set me on edge. "That's my dog," he said quickly, his voice shaky. He stepped halfway out of the door, towering over both of us, but his demeanor was anything but confident. He fumbled with the collar, gesturing vaguely at the stray before adding, "She must have gotten out." Something about the way he spoke, the nervous tone, the way he avoided eye contact, made my stomach twist. My boyfriend nodded politely, but didn't move closer. "She seems friendly," he said, his tone neutral. The man didn't respond, instead glancing over his shoulder into the building as though checking for someone or something inside. "We should go," I whispered, tugging on Coda's leash. My boyfriend didn't argue. As we walked back toward the car, I could feel the man's eyes on us, the weight of his stare following us long after we rounded the corner. The tension lingered in the air as we walked back to the car. Coda stayed close to my side, his ears flicking back and forth as if he could sense the unease I was trying so hard to suppress. My boyfriend kept glancing over his shoulder, his expression tight and serious. "That guy was weird," he said under his breath, his voice low so the employees wouldn't hear. I nodded, my thoughts racing. There was something deeply unsettling about the man's demeanor, his nervous tone, the way he avoided looking at us, and the way he kept glancing back inside the building. We reached the car, and my boyfriend quickly began refueling. I climbed into the passenger seat with Coda, locking the doors behind me. As I sat there, I glanced toward the back of the station where we had just been. The glass door was closed now, and the man was gone, but the stray dog was still sitting there watching us. Its head tilted slightly as if it were waiting for something. The sight sent a shiver down my spine. What kind of dog sits so calmly after being led away by its supposed owner? When my boyfriend finished at the pump, he muttered something about needing to use the restroom before we left. "Stay in the car," he said firmly, giving me a look that left no room for argument. I watched him walk toward the small building, glancing warily at the employees still lingering outside. They hadn't moved, but their eyes were still on us. Their low conversation, punctuated by occasional glances in our direction. As he disappeared inside, I turned my attention back to the stray dog. It had moved closer to the front of the station now, pacing near the entrance. Coda let out a low growl, his hackles rising slightly as he stared at the dog through the window. "It's okay, buddy," I murmured, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to reassure him or myself. Minutes passed, and I began to grow uneasy. My boyfriend wasn't the type to linger unnecessarily, and the longer he stayed inside, the more my anxiety grew. Just as I was about to step out and check on him, I saw movement near the restroom entrance. It was the man from the glass door. My breath caught as I watched him step into view, his massive frame blocking part of the doorway. He wasn't just standing there, he was watching. His eyes followed my boyfriend's every move, as though he were studying him, waiting for the right moment to act. My heart pounded as I reached for my phone, debating whether to call him or rush inside. Before I could do either, my boyfriend emerged, his shoulders tense and his jaw set. He walked right past the man without looking at him, his pace quickening as he made his way back to the car. The man didn't move. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on my boyfriend until he climbed into the driver's seat and locked the door. "We're leaving," my boyfriend said, his voice tight. He didn't wait for me to respond. The engine roared to life, and within seconds, we were pulling out of the lot. "What happened?" I asked, my voice shaky. He shook his head, gripping the wheel tightly. "That guy followed me into the restroom," he said. Didn't say a word, just stood there watching me like a creep. I got out as fast as I could. As we drove down the highway, the gas station faded into the darkness behind us. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following us, but the road remained empty. Still, the tension in the car was thick, and neither of us spoke for several miles. It wasn't until much later, after we had put several towns between us and that gas station, that we began to piece together the strange series of events. My boyfriend had pulled over at a rest area, needing a moment to process what had happened. As we sat in the quiet of the car, I scrolled through my phone, searching for information about the area. That's when I stumbled across the articles. The headlines were stark and chilling. Human trafficking ring busted in rural area. Desolate stops linked to suspicious disappearances. The articles described arrests made in towns not far from where we had stopped, detailing how traffickers would use isolated locations like gas stations to target vulnerable travelers. My stomach turned as I read about lures and tactics, unassuming dogs leading people away, accomplices stationed around the property, even staged interactions to test how trusting the victims might be. My boyfriend and I exchanged a glance, the weight of realization settling over us like a heavy blanket. The stray dog, the nervous man, the employees outside watching our every move. It all fit too perfectly. What would have happened if we had stayed longer? If we had followed the man's lead or ignored our instincts? I looked down at Coda, who had fallen asleep in the back seat, his large body curled protectively around himself. A wave of gratitude washed over me. Gratitude for his presence, for my boyfriend's vigilance, and for whatever instinct had driven us to leave before it was too late. The neighborhood we lived in felt like the kind of place where nothing bad could ever happen. It was quiet, tucked along a meandering river, with wide yards that rolled into patches of dense trees. Our backyard was the crown jewel of the house, a perfect mix of open space and nature's edges. It was where my child spent most of their time, exploring, laughing, and playing. Always by their side was Georgie. Georgie was more than just a pet, she was part of the family. At over 100 pounds, she was an imposing figure, but beneath her size was a gentle soul who loved everyone she met. Mail carriers would lean over the fence to scratch her ears, and the garbage collectors made it a point to say hello on their rounds. Georgie's calm presence was part of what made me feel so secure about letting my child roam freely in the yard. From my spot in the kitchen, I could see the entire backyard through the large window over the sink. Most afternoons, I'd watch them play as I washed dishes or prepared dinner. Georgie would follow my child everywhere, her massive frame moving slowly and steadily as though she was always one step ahead of potential danger. It was a routine we'd grown comfortable with, a rhythm that lulled me into believing that nothing could disturb our peaceful life. That belief shattered one afternoon, the moment I saw a man step into our yard. At first, I thought I must have imagined it. The movement at the edge of the yard was so quick, so out of place, that I blinked and stared out the window, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. But no, there he was. A man, a stranger, walking into the yard as if he had every right to be there. Something about him set my nerves on edge immediately. He wasn't dressed like a delivery worker or a neighbor dropping by unannounced. His movements were deliberate, focused, and his eyes were locked on my child, who was crouched near the bushes playing with Georgie. My stomach dropped. Without thinking, I bolted from the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. As I ran through the house, the short hallway to the back door felt like it stretched forever. I lost sight of my child for what couldn't have been more than a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. A million thoughts flooded my mind as I reached for the door. Who was this man? What did he want? Why was he here? I burst into the backyard, my voice catching in my throat as I scanned the scene. That's when I saw Georgie. She was standing stiff and tall, her thick fur bristling along her back. Her usual calm demeanor had disappeared, replaced by a low, guttural growl I had never heard from her before. The man, who had been moving toward my child, was now stumbling backward, clutching at his arm. It only took a second for me to realize what had happened. Georgie had stepped in, positioning herself between my child and the stranger. Her muzzle was stained red, a stark contrast against her white fur. The sight froze me in place. She had done what I never imagined she'd have to. She had defended my child. Georgie stood her ground, her body a wall of protection between the man and my child. Her growls rumbled like distant thunder, her sharp teeth bared in warning. The man staggered back, clutching his arm, his face twisted in pain and shock. Blood dripped onto the grass, a stark trail marking his retreat. My child, wide-eyed and frozen, stood just a few feet behind Georgie, their small hands gripping her fur for safety. I rushed forward, my instincts propelling me toward my child. "Get inside!" I yelled, my voice shaky but firm. My child hesitated for only a moment before darting toward the house, their small figure disappearing through the back door. Georgie didn't move, her body still braced against the stranger, her growls unwavering. The man looked at me then, his expression a mix of anger and fear. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but before he could utter a word, Georgie lunged forward, snapping her jaws in the air just inches from his hand. He stumbled again, tripping over his own feet as he scrambled to put distance between himself and the massive dog. For a moment, I thought he might retaliate, but something about Georgie's stance, a perfect combination of menace and control, made him think better of it. He turned and bolted, clutching his arm as he ran toward the edge of the yard. Georgie didn't chase him. Instead, she stood there, her chest heaving, watching him until he disappeared into the trees. Only then did she turn to me, her tail wagging slightly, as if to say, "It's over now." After gathering my child in my arms and making sure Georgie was unharmed, I locked every door and window in the house. My hands trembled as I called the police, recounting every detail: the man, his appearance, his injury, and how Georgie had saved the day. An officer arrived within an hour, his demeanor calm but serious as he listened to my account. As he surveyed the backyard, he noticed the blood trail leading away from the scene. "Looks like he's injured pretty bad," the officer said. "We'll follow the trail and see where it leads." I stayed inside, my child clinging to me, while Georgie sat by the door, her ears perked up as if she was still on guard. I couldn't stop shaking, the adrenaline wearing off and leaving me exhausted and terrified. Later that evening, the officer returned with an update. "We found him at a nearby motel," he said. "The staff reported a man checking in a few hours ago, bleeding and acting erratically. When we knocked on the door, he was gone. Looks like he slipped out through a window. We'll keep an eye out, but for now it seems like he's left the area." His words offered little comfort. The thought of the man escaping still out there somewhere sent a chill down my spine. What had he been planning? Why had he come into our yard? The officer couldn't answer those questions, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know.